Section 31 of Why Do We Need a Public Library? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Why Do We Need a Public Library? By Various. Section 31. Rights of Man. Part the First, being an answer to Mr. Burke's attack on the French Revolution, by Thomas Paine. Part 3. I will here cease the comparison with respect to the principles of the French Constitution, and conclude this part of the subject with a few observations on the organization of the formal parts of the French and English governments. The executive power in each country is in the hands of a person styled the king, but the French Constitution distinguishes between the king and the sovereign. It considers the station of king as official, and places sovereignty in the nation. The representatives of the nation, who compose the National Assembly, and who are the legislative power, originate in and from the people by election, as an inherent right in the people. In England it is otherwise, and this arises from the original establishment of what is called its monarchy. For, as by the conquest all the rights of the people or the nation were absorbed into the hands of the conqueror, and who added the title of king to that of conqueror, those same matters which in France are now held as rights in the people or in the nation are held in England as grants from what is called the crown. The Parliament in England, in both its branches, was erected by patents from the descendants of the conqueror. The House of Commons did not originate as a matter of right in the people to delegate or elect, but as a grant or boon. By the French Constitution, the nation is always named before the king. The third article of the Declaration of Rights says, quote, "The nation is essentially the source or fountain of all sovereignty." Unquote. Mr. Burke argues that in England a king is the fountain, that he is the fountain of all honor. But as this idea is evidently descended from the conquest, I shall make no other remark upon it than that it is the nature of conquest to turn everything upside down. And as Mr. Burke will not be refused the privilege of speaking twice, and as there are but two parts in the figure, the fountain and the spout, he will be right the second time. The French Constitution puts the legislative before the executive, the law before the king, la loi, le roi. This also is in the natural order of things, because laws must have existence before they can have execution. A king in France does not, in addressing himself to the National Assembly, say "my assembly," similar to the phrase used in England of "my parliament." Neither can he use it consistently with the Constitution, nor could it be admitted. There may be propriety in the use of it in England, because, as is before mentioned, both houses of Parliament originated from what is called the crown, by patent or boon, and not from the inherent rights of the people, as the National Assembly does in France, and whose name designates its origin. The President of the National Assembly does not ask the King to grant to the Assembly liberty of speech, as is the case with the English House of Commons. The constitutional dignity of the National Assembly cannot debase itself. Speech is, in the first place, one of the natural rights of man always retained, and with respect to the National Assembly, the use of it is their duty, and the nation is their authority. They were elected by the greatest body of men exercising the right of election the European world ever saw. They sprung not from the filth of rotten boroughs, nor are they the vassal representatives of aristocratical ones. Feeling the proper dignity of their character, they support it. Their parliamentary language, whether for or against a question, is free, bold, and manly, and extends to all parts and circumstances of the case. If any matter or subject respecting the executive department or the person who presides in it, the king, comes before them, it is debated on with the spirit of men and in the language of gentlemen, and their answer or their address is returned in the same style. They stand not aloof with the gaping vacuity of vulgar ignorance, nor bend with the cringe of sycophantic insignificance. The graceful pride of truth knows no extremes, and preserves in every latitude of life the right-angled character of man. Let us now look to the other side of the question. In the addresses of the English parliaments to their kings, we see neither the intrepid spirit of the old parliaments of France, nor the serene dignity of the present National Assembly. Neither do we see in them anything of the style of English manners, which border somewhat on bluntness. Since then they are neither of foreign extraction, nor naturally of English production, their origin must be sought for elsewhere, and that origin is the Norman Conquest. They are evidently of the vassalage class of manners, and emphatically mark the prostrate distance that exists in no other condition of men than between the conqueror and the conquered. That this vassalage idea and style of speaking was not got rid of even at the Revolution of 1688 is evident from the declaration of Parliament to William and Mary in these words, quote, "We do most humbly and faithfully submit ourselves, our heirs and posterities, forever." Unquote. Submission is wholly a vassalage term, repugnant to the dignity of freedom, and an echo of the language used at the Conquest. As the estimation of all things is given by comparison, the Revolution of 1688, however from circumstances it may have been exalted beyond its value, will find its level. It is already on the wane, eclipsed by the enlarging orb of reason and the luminous revolutions of America and France. In less than another century it will go, as well as Mr. Burke's labors, quote, "to the family vault of all the Capulets." Unquote. Mankind will then scarcely believe that a country calling itself free would send to Holland for a man and clothe him with power on purpose to put themselves in fear of him, and give him almost £1,000,000 sterling a year for leave to submit themselves and their posterity, like bondmen and bondwomen, forever. But there is a truth that ought to be made known. I have had the opportunity of seeing it, which is, that notwithstanding appearances, there is not any description of men that despise monarchy so much as courtiers. But they well know that if it were seen by others as it is seen by them, the juggle could not be kept up. They are in the condition of men who get their living by a show, and to whom the folly of that show is so familiar that they ridicule it. But were the audience to be made as wise in this respect as themselves, there would be an end to the show and the profits with it. The difference between a republican and a courtier, with respect to monarchy, is that one opposes monarchy, believing it to be something, and the other laughs at it, knowing it to be nothing. As I used sometimes to correspond with Mr. Burke, believing him then to be a man of sounder principles than his book shows him to be, I wrote to him last winter from Paris, and gave him an account how prosperously matters were going on. Among other subjects in that letter, I referred to the happy situation the National Assembly were placed in, that they had taken ground on which their moral duty and their political interest were united. They have not to hold out a language which they do not themselves believe, for the fraudulent purpose of making others believe it. Their station requires no artifice to support it, and can only be maintained by enlightening mankind. It is not their interest to cherish ignorance, but to dispel it. They are not in the case of a ministerial or an opposition party in England, who, though they are opposed, are still united to keep up the common mystery. The National Assembly must throw open a magazine of light. It must show man the proper character of man, and the nearer it can bring him to that standard, the stronger the National Assembly becomes. In contemplating the French Constitution, we see in it a rational order of things. The principles harmonize with the forms, and both with their origin. It may perhaps be said as an excuse for bad forms that they are nothing more than forms, but this is a mistake. Forms grow out of principles, and operate to continue the principles they grow from. It is impossible to practice a bad form on anything but a bad principle. It cannot be engrafted on a good one, and wherever the forms in any government are bad, it is a certain indication that the principles are bad also. I will here finally close this subject. I began it by remarking that Mr. Burke had voluntarily declined going into a comparison of the English and French constitutions. He apologizes in page 241 for not doing it, by saying that he had not time. Mr. Burke's book was upwards of 8 months in hand, and is extended to a volume of 366 pages. As his omission does injury to his cause, his apology makes it worse, and men on the English side of the water will begin to consider whether there is not some radical defect in what is called the English Constitution, that made it necessary for Mr. Burke to suppress the comparison, to avoid bringing it into view. As Mr. Burke has not written on constitutions, so neither has he written on the French Revolution. He gives no account of its commencement or its progress. He only expresses his wonder. Quote, "It looks," says he, "to me as if I were in a great crisis, not of the affairs of France alone, but of all Europe, perhaps of more than Europe. All circumstances taken together, the French Revolution is the most astonishing that has hitherto happened in the world." Unquote. As wise men are astonished at foolish things, and other people at wise ones, I know not on which ground to account for Mr. Burke's astonishment. But certain it is that he does not understand the French Revolution. It has apparently burst forth like a creation from a chaos, but it is no more than the consequence of a mental revolution priorly existing in France. The mind of the nation had changed beforehand, and the new order of things has naturally followed the new order of thoughts. I will here, as concisely as I can, trace out the growth of the French Revolution, and mark the circumstances that have contributed to produce it. The despotism of Louis XIV, united with the gaiety of his court and the gaudy ostentation of his character, had so humbled and at the same time so fascinated the mind of France, that the people appeared to have lost all sense of their own dignity, in contemplating that of their grand monarch, and the whole reign of Louis XV, remarkable only for weakness and effeminacy, made no other alteration than that of spreading a sort of lethargy over the nation, from which it showed no disposition to rise. The only signs which appeared to the spirit of liberty during those periods are to be found in the writings of the French philosophers. Montesquieu, president of the Parliament of Bordeaux, went as far as a writer under a despotic government could well proceed, and being obliged to divide himself between principle and prudence, his mind often appears under a veil, and we ought to give him credit for more than he has expressed. Voltaire, who was both the flatterer and the satirist of despotism, took another line. His forte lay in exposing and ridiculing the superstitions which priestcraft, united with statecraft, had interwoven with governments. It is not from the purity of his principles or his love of mankind, for satire and philanthropy are not naturally concordant, but from his strong capacity of seeing folly in its true shape, and his irresistible propensity to expose it, that he made those attacks. They were, however, as formidable as if the motive had been virtuous, and he merits the thanks rather than the esteem of mankind. On the contrary, we find in the writings of Rousseau and the Abbé Raynal a loveliness of sentiment in favor of liberty that excites respect and elevates the human faculties, but having raised this animation, they do not direct its operation, and leave the mind in love with an object without describing the means of possessing it. The writings of Quesnay, Turgot, and the friends of those authors are of the serious kind, but they labored under the same disadvantage with Montesquieu. Their writings abound with moral maxims of government, but are rather directed to economize and reform the administration of the government than the government itself. But all those writings, and many others, had their weight, and by the different manner in which they treated the subject of government, Montesquieu by his judgment and knowledge of laws, Voltaire by his wit, Rousseau and Raynal by their animation, and Quesnay and Turgot by their moral maxims and systems of economy, readers of every class met with something to their taste, and a spirit of political inquiry began to diffuse itself through the nation at the time the dispute between England and the then colonies of America broke out. In the war which France afterwards engaged in, it is very well known that the nation appeared to be beforehand with the French ministry. Each of them had its view, but those views were directed to different objects. The one sought liberty, and the other retaliation on England. The French officers and soldiers who after this went to America were eventually placed in the School of Freedom, and learned the practice as well as the principles of it by heart. As it was impossible to separate the military events which took place in America from the principles of the American Revolution, the publication of those events in France necessarily connected themselves with the principles which produced them. Many of the facts were in themselves principles, such as the Declaration of American Independence and the Treaty of Alliance between France and America, which recognized the natural rights of man and justified resistance to oppression. The then Minister of France, Count Vergennes, was not the friend of America, and it is both justice and gratitude to say that it was the Queen of France who gave the cause of America a fashion at the French court. Count Vergennes was the personal and social friend of Dr. Franklin, and the doctor had obtained by his sensible gracefulness a sort of influence over him. But with respect to principles, Count Vergennes was a despot. The situation of Dr. Franklin as minister from America to France should be taken into the chain of circumstances. The diplomatic character is of itself the narrowest sphere of society that man can act in. It forbids intercourse by the reciprocity of suspicion, and a diplomatic is a sort of unconnected atom, continually repelling and repelled. But this was not the case with Dr. Franklin. He was not the diplomatic of a court, but of man. His character as a philosopher had been long established, and his circle of society in France was universal. Count Vergennes resisted for a considerable time the publication in France of American constitutions translated into the French language, but even in this he was obliged to give way to public opinion, and a sort of propriety in admitting to appear what he had undertaken to defend. The American constitutions were to liberty what a grammar is to language. They define its parts of speech and practically construct them into syntax. The peculiar situation of the then Marquis de Lafayette is another link in the great chain. He served in America as an American officer under a commission of Congress, and by the universality of his acquaintance was in close friendship with the civil government of America, as well as with the military line. He spoke the language of the country, entered into the discussions on the principles of government, and was always a welcome friend at any election. When the war closed, a vast reinforcement to the cause of liberty spread itself over France by the return of the French officers and soldiers. A knowledge of the practice was then joined to the theory, and all that was wanting to give it real existence was opportunity. Man cannot, properly speaking, make circumstances for his purpose, but he always has it in his power to improve them when they occur, and this was the case in France. Monsieur Necker was displaced in May 1781, and by the ill management of the finances afterwards, and particularly during the extravagant administration of Monsieur Colleen, the revenue of France, which was nearly 24 millions sterling per year, was become unequal to the expenditure, not because the revenue had decreased, but because the expenses had increased, and this was a circumstance which the nation laid hold of to bring forward a revolution. The English minister, Mr. Pitt, has frequently alluded to the state of French finances in his budgets without understanding the subject. Had the French parliaments been as ready to register edicts for new taxes as an English parliament is to grant them, there had been no derangement in the finances, nor yet any revolution. But this will better explain itself as I proceed. It will be necessary here to show how taxes were formerly raised in France. The king, or rather the court or ministry acting under the use of that name, framed the edicts for taxes at their own discretion, and sent them to the parliaments to be registered, for until they were registered by the parliaments they were not operative. Disputes had long existed between the court and the parliaments with respect to the extent of the parliament's authority on this head. The court insisted that the authority of parliaments went no farther than to remonstrate or show reasons against the tax, reserving to itself the right of determining whether the reasons were well or ill-founded, and in consequence thereof either to withdraw the edict as a matter of choice, or to order it to be unregistered as a matter of authority. The parliaments, on their part, insisted that they had not only a right to remonstrate, but to reject, and on this ground they were always supported by the nation. But to return to the order of my narrative. Monsieur Colleen wanted money, and as he knew the sturdy disposition of the parliaments with respect to new taxes, he ingeniously sought either to approach them by a more gentle means than that of direct authority, or to get over their heads by a maneuver. And for this purpose he revived the project of assembling a body of men from the several provinces, under the style of an Assembly of the Notables, or Men of Note, who met in 1787, and who were either to recommend taxes to the parliaments, or to act as a parliament themselves. An assembly under this name had been called in 1617. As we are to view this as the first practical step toward the Revolution, it will be proper to enter into some particulars respecting it. The Assembly of the Notables has in some places been mistaken for the States General, but was wholly a different body, the States General being always by election. The persons who composed the Assembly of the Notables were all nominated by the king, and consisted of 140 members. But as Monsieur Calonne could not depend upon a majority of this assembly in his favor, he very ingeniously arranged them in such a manner as to make 44 a majority of 140. To effect this, he disposed of them into 7 separate committees, of 20 members each. Every general question was to be decided not by a majority of persons, but by a majority of committee, and as 11 votes would make a majority in a committee, and 4 committees a majority of 7, Monsieur Calonne had good reason to conclude that as 44 would determine any general question, he could not be outvoted. But all his plans deceived him, and in the event became his overthrow. The then Marquis de Lafayette was placed in the second committee, of which the Count d'Artois was president, and as money matters were the object, it naturally brought into view every circumstance connected with it. Monsieur de Lafayette made a verbal charge against Calonne for selling crown lands to the amount of 2 millions of livres, in a manner that appeared to be unknown to the king. The Count d'Artois, as if to intimidate, for the Bastille was then in being, asked the Marquis if he would render the charge in writing. He replied that he would. The Count d'Artois did not demand it, but brought a message from the king to that purport. Monsieur de Lafayette then delivered in his charge in writing, to be given to the king, undertaking to support it. No farther proceedings were had upon this affair, but Monsieur Calonne was soon after dismissed by the king and set off to England. As Monsieur de Lafayette, from the experience of what he had seen in America, was better acquainted with the science of civil government than the generality of the members who composed the Assembly of the Notables could then be, the brunt of the business fell considerably to his share. The plan of those who had a constitution in view was to contend with the court on the ground of taxes, and some of them openly professed their object. Disputes frequently arose between Count d'Artois and Monsieur de Lafayette upon various subjects. With respect to the arrears already incurred, the latter proposed to remedy them by accommodating the expenses to the revenue instead of the revenue to the expenses, and as objects of reform he proposed to abolish the Bastille and all the state prisons throughout the nation, the keeping of which was attended with great expense, and to suppress lettres de cachet, but those matters were not then much attended to, and with respect to lettres de cachet a majority of the nobles appeared to be in favor of them. On the subject of supplying the treasury by new taxes, the Assembly declined taking the matter on themselves, concurring in the opinion that they had not authority. In a debate on this subject, Monsieur de Lafayette said that raising money by taxes could only be done by a National Assembly, freely elected by the people and acting as their representatives. "Do you mean," said the Count d'Artois, "the States General?" Monsieur de Lafayette replied that he did. "Will you," said the Count d'Artois, "sign what you say to be given to the king?" The other replied that he would not only do this, but that he would go farther, and say that the effectual mode would be for the king to agree to the establishment of a constitution. As one of the plans had thus failed, that of getting the Assembly to act as a parliament, the other came into view, that of recommending. On this subject, the Assembly agreed to recommend 2 new taxes to be unregistered by the Parliament, the one a stamp tax and the other a territorial tax or sort of land tax. The 2 have been estimated at about 5 millions sterling per annum. We have now to turn our attention to the parliaments, on whom the business was again devolving. The Archbishop of Toulouse, since Archbishop of Sens, and now a cardinal, was appointed to the administration of the finances soon after the dismission of Calonne. He was also made prime minister, an office that did not always exist in France. When this office did not exist, the chief of each of the principal departments transacted business immediately with the king. But when a prime minister was appointed, they did business only with him. The archbishop arrived to more state authority than any minister since the Duc de Choiseul, and the nation was strongly disposed in his favor. But by a line of conduct scarcely to be accounted for, he perverted every opportunity, turned out a despot, and sunk into disgrace and a cardinal. The Assembly of the Notables having broken up, the minister sent the edicts for the 2 new taxes recommended by the Assembly to the parliaments to be unregistered. They, of course, came first before the Parliament of Paris, who returned for answer, quote, that with such a revenue as the nation then supported, the name of taxes ought not to be mentioned but for the purpose of reducing them, unquote, and threw both the edicts out. Footnote. When the English Prime Minister, Mr. Pitt, mentions the French finances again in the English Parliament, It would be well that he noticed this as an example. End of footnote. On this refusal, the Parliament was ordered to Versailles, where, in the usual form, the king held what under the old government was called a bed of justice, and the two edicts were unregistered in presence of the Parliament by an order of state, in the manner mentioned earlier. On this, the Parliament immediately returned to Paris, renewed their session in form, and ordered the enregistering to be struck out, declaring that everything done at Versailles was illegal. All the members of the Parliament were then served with letters to cachet and exiled to Troyes, but they continued as inflexible in exile as before, and as vengeance did not supply the place of taxes, they were, after a short time, recalled to Paris. The edicts were again tendered to them, and the Count d'Artois undertook to act as representative of the king. For this purpose he came from Versailles to Paris in a train of procession, and the Parliament were assembled to receive him. But show and parade had lost their influence in France, and whatever ideas of importance he might set off with, he had to return with those of mortification and disappointment. On alighting from his carriage to ascend the steps of the Parliament House, the crowd, which was numerously collected, threw out trite expressions, saying, "This is Monsieur d'Artois, who wants more of our money to spend." The marked disapprobation which he saw impressed him with apprehensions, and the word "arms" to arms was given out by the officer of the guard who attended him. It was so loudly vociferated that it echoed through the avenues of the house, and produced a temporary confusion. I was then standing in one of the apartments through which he had to pass, and could not avoid reflecting how wretched was the condition of a disrespected man. He endeavored to impress the Parliament by great words, and opened his authority by saying, quote, "The King, our lord and master." Unquote. The Parliament received him very coolly, and with their usual determination not to register the taxes, and in this manner the interview ended. After this a new subject took place. In the various debates and contests which arose between the court and the parliaments on the subject of taxes, the Parliament of Paris at last declared that although it had been customary for parliaments to enregister edicts for taxes as a matter of convenience, the right belonged only to the States General, and that therefore the Parliament could no longer with propriety continue to debate on what it had not authority to act. The king after this came to Paris and held a meeting with the Parliament, in which he continued from 10 in the morning till about 6 in the evening, and in a manner that appeared to proceed from him as if unconsulted upon with the cabinet or ministry, gave his word to the Parliament that the States General should be convened. But after this another scene arose, on a ground different from all the former. The minister and the cabinet were averse to calling the States General. They well knew that if the States General were assembled, themselves must fall, and as the king had not mentioned any time, they hit on a project calculated to elude without appearing to oppose. For this purpose, the court set about making a sort of constitution itself. It was principally the work of Monsieur Lamoignon, the keeper of the seals, who afterwards shot himself. This new arrangement consisted in establishing a body under the name of a cour plénière, or full court, in which were invested all the powers that the government might have occasion to make use of. The persons composing this court were to be nominated by the king. The contended right of taxation was given up on the part of the king, and a new criminal code of laws and law proceedings was substituted in the room of the former. The thing, in many points, contained better principles than those upon which the government had hitherto been administered, but with respect to the cour plénière, it was no other than a medium through which despotism was to pass, without appearing to act directly from itself. The cabinet had high expectations from their new contrivance. The people who were to compose the cour plénière were already nominated, and as it was necessary to carry a fair appearance, many of the best characters in the nation were appointed among the number. It was to commence on May 8, 1788, but an opposition arose to it on two grounds, the one as to principle, the other as to form. On the ground of principle it was contended that government had not a right to alter itself, and that if the practice was once admitted, it would grow into a principle and be made precedent for any future alterations the government might wish to establish; that the right of altering the government was a national right, and not a right of the government. And on the ground of form it was contended that the cour plénière was nothing more than a larger cabinet. The then Duc de la Rochefoucauld, Luxembourg, de Noailles, and many others refused to accept the nomination, and strenuously opposed the whole plan. When the edict for establishing this new court was sent to the parliaments to be unregistered and put into execution, they resisted also. The Parliament of Paris not only refused, but denied the authority, and the contest renewed itself between the Parliament and the Cabinet more strongly than ever. While the Parliament were sitting in debate on this subject, the ministry ordered a regiment of soldiers to surround the house and form a blockade. The members sent out for beds and provisions and lived as in a besieged citadel. And as this had no effect, the commanding officer was ordered to enter the Parliament House and seize them, which he did, and some of the principal members were shut up in different prisons. About the same time, a deputation of persons arrived from the province of Brittany to remonstrate against the establishment of the Cour Plénière, and those the Archbishop sent to the Bastille. But the spirit of the nation was not to be overcome, and it was so fully sensible of the strong ground it had taken, that of withholding taxes, that it contented itself with keeping up a sort of quiet resistance, which effectually overthrew all the plans at that time formed against it. The project of the Cour Plénière was at last obliged to be given up, and the Prime Minister not long afterwards followed its fate, and M. Necker was recalled into office. The attempt to establish the Cour Plénière had an effect upon the nation which itself did not perceive. It was a sort of new form of government that insensibly served to put the old one out of sight and to unhinge it from the superstitious authority of antiquity. It was government dethroning government, and the old one, by attempting to make a new one, made a chasm. The failure of this scheme renewed the subject of convening the State General, and this gave rise to a new series of politics. There was no settled form for convening the States General. All that it positively meant was a deputation from what was then called the clergy, the noblesse, and the commons, but their numbers or their proportions had not always been the same. They had been convened only on extraordinary occasions, the last of which was in 1614. Their numbers were then in equal proportions, and they voted by orders. It could not well escape the sagacity of M. Necker that the mode of 1614 would answer neither the purpose of the then government nor of the nation. As matters were at that time circumstanced, it would have been too contentious to agree upon anything. The debates would have been endless upon privileges and exemptions, in which neither the wants of the government nor the wishes of the nation for a constitution would have been attended to. But as he did not choose to take the decision upon himself, he summoned again the assembly of the notables and referred it to them. This body was in general interested in the decision, being chiefly of aristocracy and high-paid clergy, and they decided in favor of the mode of 1614. This decision was against the sense of the nation and also against the wishes of the court, for the aristocracy opposed itself to both and contended for privileges independent of either. The subject was then taken up by the Parliament, who recommended that the number of the commons should be equal to the other two, and they should all sit in one house and vote in one body. The number finally determined on was 1,200, 600 to be chosen by the commons, and this was less than their proportion ought to have been when their worth and consequence is considered on a national scale, 300 by the clergy and 300 by the aristocracy. But with respect to the mode of assembling themselves, whether together or apart, or the manner in which they should vote, those matters were referred. Footnote. Mr. Burke, and I must take the liberty of telling him that he is very unacquainted with French affairs, speaking upon this subject says, quote, "The first thing that struck me in calling the States General was a great departure from the ancient course," unquote. And he soon after says, quote, "From the moment I read the list, I saw distinctly, and very nearly as it happened, all that was to follow," unquote. Mr. Burke certainly did not see what was to follow. I endeavored to impress him, as well before as after the States General met, that there would be a revolution, but was not able to make him see it, neither would he believe it. How, then, he could distinctly see all the parts when the whole was out of sight is beyond my comprehension. And with respect to the departure from the ancient course, besides the natural weakness of the remark, it shows that he is unacquainted with circumstances. The departure was necessary from the experience had upon it that the ancient course was a bad one. The States General of 1614 were called at the commencement of the Civil War in the minority of Louis XIII, but by the class arranging themselves by orders, they increased the confusion they were called to compose. The author of L'Intrigue du Cabinet, Intrigue of the Cabinet, who wrote before any revolution was thought of in France, speaking of the States General of 1614, says, quote, "They held the public in suspense 5 months, and by the questions agitated therein, and the heat with which they were put, it appears that the great Legrand thought more to satisfy their particular passions than to procure the goods of the nation, and the whole time passed away in altercations, ceremonies, and parade." Unquote. L'Intrigue du Cabinet, Volume 1, page 329. End of footnote. The election that followed was not a contested election, but an animated one. The candidates were not men, but principals. Societies were formed in Paris, and committees of correspondence and communication established throughout the nation, for the purpose of enlightening the people, and explaining to them the principles of civil government, and so orderly was the election conducted that it did not give rise even to the rumor of tumult. The States General were to meet at Versailles in April 1789, but did not assemble till May. They situated themselves in 3 separate chambers, or rather the clergy and aristocracy withdrew each into a separate chamber. The majority of the aristocracy claimed what they called the privilege of voting as a separate body, and of giving their consent or their negative in that manner, and many of the bishops and the high beneficed clergy claimed the same privilege on the part of their order. The tiers état, as they were then called, disowned any knowledge of artificial orders and artificial privileges, and they were not only resolute on this point, but somewhat disdainful. They began to consider the aristocracy as a kind of fungus growing out of the corruption of society that could not be admitted even as a branch of it, and from the disposition the aristocracy had shown by upholding lettres de cachet, and in sundry other instances, it was manifest that no constitution could be formed by admitting men in any other character than as national men. After various altercations on this head, the tiers état, or commons, as they were then called, declared themselves on a motion made for that purpose by the Abbé Sieyes, quote, "the representative of the nation," and that the 2 orders could be considered but as deputies of corporations, and could only have a deliberate voice when they assembled in a national character with the national representatives. Unquote. This proceeding extinguished the style of États Généraux, or States General, and erected it into the style it now bears, that of l'Assemblée Nationale, or National Assembly. This motion was not made in a precipitate manner. It was the result of cool deliberation and concerned between the national representatives and the patriotic members of the 2 chambers, who saw into the folly, mischief, and injustice of artificial privileged distinctions. It was become evident that no constitution worthy of being called by that name could be established on anything less than a national ground. The aristocracy had hitherto opposed the despotism of the court, and affected the language of patriotism, but it opposed it as its rival, as the English barons opposed King John, and it now opposed the nation from the same motives. On carrying this motion, the national representatives, as had been concerted, sent an invitation to the 2 chambers to unite with them in a national character and proceed to business. A majority of the clergy, chiefly of the parish priests, withdrew from the clerical chamber, and joined the nation, and 45 from the other chamber joined in like manner. There is a sort of secret history belonging to this last circumstance which is necessary to its explanation. It was not judged prudent that all the patriotic members of the chamber styling itself the nobles should quit it at once, and in consequence of this arrangement they drew off by degrees, always leaving some, as well to reason the case as to watch the suspected. In a little time the numbers increased from 45 to 80, and soon after to a greater number, which, with the majority of the clergy and the whole of the national representatives, put the malcontents in a very diminutive condition. The king, who, very different from the general class called by that name, is a man of good heart, showed himself disposed to recommend a union of the 3 chambers, on the ground the National Assembly had taken, but the malcontents exerted themselves to prevent it, and began now to have another project in view. Their numbers consisted of a majority of the aristocratical chamber, and the minority of the clerical chamber, chiefly of bishops and high beneficed clergy, and these men were determined to put everything to issue, as well by strength as by stratagem. They had no objection to a constitution, but it must be such a one they themselves should dictate, and suited to their own views and particular situations. On the other hand, the nation disowned knowing anything of them but as citizens, and was determined to shut out all such upstart pretensions. The more aristocracy appeared, the more it was despised. There was a visible imbecility and want of intellects in the majority, a sort of je ne sais quoi, that while it affected to be more than citizen, was less than man. It lost ground from contempt more than from hatred, and was rather jeered at as an ass than dreaded as a lion. This is the general character of aristocracy, or what are called nobles or nobility, or rather no-ability, in all countries. The plan of the malcontents consisted now of two things: either to deliberate and vote by chambers or orders, more especially on all questions respecting a constitution, by which the aristocratical chamber would have had a negative on any article of the constitution, or, in case they could not accomplish this object, to overthrow the National Assembly entirely. To effect one or the other of these objects, they began to cultivate a friendship with the despotism they had hitherto attempted to rival, and the Count d'Artois became their chief. The king, who has since declared himself deceived in their measures, held, according to the old form, a bed of justice, in which he accorded to the deliberation and vote par tête, by head, upon several subjects, but reserved the deliberation and vote upon all questions respecting a constitution to the three chambers separately. This declaration of the king was made against the advice of M. Necker, who now began to perceive that he was growing out of fashion at court, and that another minister was in contemplation. As the form of sitting in separate chambers was yet apparently kept up, though essentially destroyed, the national representatives immediately after this declaration of the king resorted to their own chambers to consult on a protest against it, and the minority of the chamber calling itself the nobles, who had joined in the national cause, retired to a private house to consult in like manner. The malcontents had by this time concerted their measures with the court, which the Count d'Artois undertook to conduct, and as they saw from the discontent which the declaration excited, and the opposition making against it, that they could not obtain a control over the intended constitution by a separate vote, they prepared themselves for their final object, that of conspiring against the National Assembly and overthrowing it. The next morning, the door of the chamber of the National Assembly was shut against them and guarded by troops, and the members were refused admittance. On this, they withdrew to a tennis ground in the neighborhood of Versailles, as the most convenient place they could find, and after renewing their session, took an oath never to separate from each other under any circumstance whatever, death excepted, until they had established a constitution. As the experiment of shutting up the House had no other effect than that of producing a closer connection in the members, it was opened again the next day, and the public business recommenced in the usual place. We are now to have in view the forming of the new ministry, which was to accomplish the overthrow of the National Assembly. But as force would be necessary, orders were issued to assemble 30,000 troops, the command of which was given to Broglio, one of the intended new ministry, who was recalled from the country for this purpose. But as some management was necessary to keep this plan concealed till the moment it should be ready for execution, it is to this policy that a declaration made by Count d'Artois must be attributed, and which is here proper to be introduced. It could not but occur, while the malcontents continued to resort to their chambers separate from the National Assembly, more jealousy would be excited than if they were mixed with it, and that the plot might be suspected. But as they had taken their ground, and now wanted a pretense for quitting it, it was necessary that one should be devised. This was effectually accomplished by a declaration made by the Count d'Artois, quote, that if they took not a part in the National Assembly, the life of the king would be endangered, unquote, on which they quitted their chambers and mixed with the assembly in one body. At the time this declaration was made, it was generally treated as a piece of absurdity in Count d'Artois calculated merely to relieve the outstanding members of the two chambers from the diminutive situation they were put in, and if nothing more had followed, this conclusion would have been good. But as things best explain themselves by their events, this apparent union was only a cover to the machinations which were secretly going on, and the declaration accommodated itself to answer that purpose. In a little time the National Assembly found itself surrounded by troops, and thousands more were daily arriving. On this, a very strong declaration was made by the National Assembly to the king, remonstrating on the impropriety of the measure, and demanding the reason. The king, who was not in the secret of this business, as himself afterwards declared, gave substantially for answer that he had no other object in view than to preserve the public tranquillity, which appeared to be much disturbed. But in a few days from this time the plot unravelled itself. Monsieur Necker and the ministry were displaced, and a new one formed of the enemies of the Revolution. Ambroglio, with between 25 and 30,000 foreign troops, was arrived to support them. The mask was now thrown off, and matters were come to a crisis. The event was that in a space of 3 days the new ministry and their abettors found it prudent to fly the nation. The Bastille was taken, Ambroglio and his foreign troops dispersed, as is already related in the former part of this work. There are some curious circumstances in the history of this short-lived ministry and this short-lived attempt at a counter-revolution. The palace of Versailles, where the court was sitting, was not more than 400 yards distant from the hall where the National Assembly was sitting. The two places were at this moment like the separate headquarters of two combatant armies, yet the court was as perfectly ignorant of the information which had arrived from Paris to the National Assembly as if it had resided at 100 miles distant. The then Marquis de Lafayette, who, as has already been mentioned, was chosen to preside in the National Assembly on this particular occasion, named by the order of the Assembly 3 successive deputations to the king, on the day and up to the evening on which the Bastille was taken, to inform and confer with him on the state of affairs, but the ministry, who knew not so much as that it was attacked, precluded all communication, and were solacing themselves how dexterously they had succeeded. But in a few hours the accounts arrived so thick and fast that they had to start from their desks and run. Some set off in one disguise, and some in another, and none in their own character. Their anxiety now was to outride the news, lest they should be stopped, which, though it flew fast, flew not so fast as themselves. It is worth remarking that the National Assembly neither pursued those fugitive conspirators, nor took any notice of them, nor sought to retaliate in any shape whatever. Occupied with establishing a constitution founded on the rights of man and the authority of the people, the only authority on which government has a right to exist in any country, the National Assembly felt none of those mean passions which mark the character of impertinent governments, founding themselves on their own authority, or on the absurdity of hereditary succession. It is the faculty of the human mind to become what it contemplates, and to act in unison with its object. The conspiracy being thus dispersed, one of the first works of the National Assembly, instead of vindictive proclamations, as has been the case with other governments, was to publish a declaration of the rights of man, as the basis on which the new Constitution was to be built, and which is here subjoined. Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens by the National Assembly of France. The representatives of the people of France formed into a National Assembly, considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of human rights are the sole causes of public misfortunes and corruptions of government, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration these natural, imprescriptible, and inalienable rights, that this declaration being constantly present to the minds of the members of the body social, they may be forever kept attentive to their rights and their duties, that the acts of the legislative and executive powers of government, being capable of being every moment compared with the end of political institutions, may be more respected, and also that the future claims of the citizens, being directed by simple and incontestable principles, may always tend to the maintenance of the Constitution and the general happiness. For these reasons, the National Assembly doth recognize and declare, in the presence of the Supreme Being, and with the hope of his blessing and favor, the following sacred rights of men and citizens. 1. Men are born, and always continue, free and equal in respect of their rights. Civil distinctions, therefore, can be founded only on public utility. 2. The end of all political associations is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, and these rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance of oppression. 3. The nation is essentially the source of all sovereignty, nor can any individual or any body of men be entitled to any authority which is not expressly derived from it. 4. Political liberty consists in the power of doing whatever does not injure another. The exercise of the natural rights of every man has no other limits than those which are necessary to secure to every other man the free exercise of the same rights, and these limits are determinable only by the law. 5. The law ought to prohibit only actions hurtful to society. What is not prohibited by the law should not be hindered, nor should anyone be compelled to that which the law does not require. 6. The law is an expression of the will of the community. All citizens have a right to concur, either personally or by their representatives, in its formation. It should be the same to all, whether it protects or punishes, and all being equal in its sight are equally eligible to all honors, places, and employments, according to their different abilities, without any other distinction than that created by their virtues and talents. 7. No man should be accused, arrested, or held in confinement, except in cases determined by the law, and according to the forms which it has prescribed. All who promote, solicit, execute, or cause to be executed arbitrary orders ought to be punished, and every citizen called upon, or apprehended by virtue of the law, ought immediately to obey and renders himself culpable by resistance. 8. The law ought to impose no other penalties but such are absolutely and evidently necessary, and no one ought to be punished but in virtue of a law promulgated before the offense and legally applied. 9. Every man being presumed innocent till he has been convicted, whenever his detention becomes indispensable, all rigor to him, more than is necessary to secure his person, ought to be provided against by the law. 10. No man ought to be molested on account of his opinions, not even on account of his religious opinions, provided his avowal of them does not disturb the public order established by the law. 11. The unrestrained communication of thoughts and opinions being one of the most precious rights of man, every citizen may speak, write, and publish freely, provided he is responsible for the abuse of this liberty in cases determined by the law. 12. A public force being necessary to give security to the rights of men and of citizens, that force is instituted for the benefit of the community, and not for the particular benefit of the persons to whom it is entrusted. 13. A common contribution being necessary for the support of the public force, and for defraying the other expenses of government, it ought to be divided equally among the members of the community according to their abilities. 14. Every citizen has a right, either by himself or his representative, to a free voice in determining the necessity of public contributions, the appropriation of them, and their amount, mode of assessment, and duration. 15. Every community has a right to demand of all its agents an account of their conduct. 16. Every community in which a separation of powers and a security of rights is not provided for wants a constitution. 17. The right to property being inviolable and sacred, no one ought to be deprived of it, except in cases of evident public necessity, legally ascertained, and on condition of a previous just indemnity. Observations on the Declaration of Rights. The first 3 articles comprehend, in general terms, the whole of a Declaration of Rights. All the succeeding articles either originate from them or follow as elucidations. The 4th, 5th, and 6th define more particularly what is only generally expressed in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th articles are declaratory of principles upon which laws shall be constructed, conformable to rights already declared. But it is questioned by some very good people in France, as well as in other countries, whether the 10th article sufficiently guarantees the right is intended to accord with, besides which it takes off from the divine dignity of religion, and weakens its operative force upon the mind to make it a subject of human laws. It then presents itself to man like light intercepted by a cloudy medium, in which the source of it is obscured from his sight, and he sees nothing to reverence in the dusky ray. Footnote. There is a single idea which, if it strikes rightly upon the mind, either in a legal or a religious sense, will prevent any man or any body of men, or any government, from going wrong on the subject of religion, which is that before any human institutions of government were known in the world, there existed, if I may so express it, a compact between God and man, from the beginning of time, and that as the relation and condition which man in his individual person stands in towards his Maker cannot be changed by any human laws or human authority, that religious devotion, which is a part of this compact, cannot so much as be made a subject of human laws, and that all laws must conform themselves to this prior existing compact, and not assume to make the compact conform to the laws, which, besides being human, are subsequent thereto. The first act of man, when he looked around and saw himself a creature which he did not make, and a world furnished for his reception, must have been devotion, and devotion must ever continue sacred to every individual man, as it appears right to him, and the governments do mischief by interfering. End of footnote. The remaining articles, beginning with the 12th, are substantially contained in the principles of the preceding articles, but in the particular situation in which France then was, having to undo what was wrong as well as to set up what was right, it was proper to be more particular than what in another condition of things would be necessary. While the Declaration of Rights was before the National Assembly, some of its members remarked that if a Declaration of Rights were published, it should be accompanied by a Declaration of Duties. The observation discovered a mind that reflected, and it only erred by not reflecting far enough. A Declaration of Rights is, by reciprocity, a Declaration of Duties also. Whatever is my right as a man is also the right of another, and it becomes my duty to guarantee as well as to possess. The first 3 articles are the base of liberty, as well individual as national. Nor can any country be called free whose government does not take its beginning from the principles they contain, and continue to preserve them pure. And the whole of the Declaration of Rights is of more value to the world and will do more good than all the laws and statutes that have yet been promulgated. In the declaratory exordium which prefaces the Declaration of Rights, we see the solemn and majestic spectacle of a nation opening its commission, under the auspices of its Creator, to establish a government, a scene so new and so transcendently unequaled by anything in the European world that the name of a revolution is diminutive of its character, and it rises into a regeneration of man. What are the present governments of Europe but a scene of iniquity and oppression? What is that of England? Do not its own inhabitants say it is a market where every man has his price, and where corruption is common traffic at the expense of a deluded people? No wonder, then, that the French Revolution is traduced. Had it confined itself merely to the destruction of flagrant despotism, perhaps Mr. Burke and some others had been silent. Their cry now is, it has gone too far. That is, it has gone too far for them. It stares corruption in the face, and the venal tribe are all alarmed. Their fear discovers itself in their outrage, and they are but publishing the groans of a wounded vice. But from such opposition, the French Revolution, instead of suffering, receives an homage. The more it is struck, the more sparks it will emit, and the fear is it will not be struck enough. It has nothing to dread from attacks. Truth has given it an establishment, and time will record it with a name as lasting as his own. Having now traced the progress of the French Revolution through most of its principal stages, from its commencement to the taking of the Bastille and its establishment by the Declaration of Rights, I will close the subject with the energetic apostrophe of Monsieur de Lafayette. Quote, "May this great monument raised to liberty serve as a lesson to the oppressor and an example to the oppressed." Unquote. Footnote. See this work, Part 1, starting at line number 254. Note well, since the taking of the Bastille, the occurrences have been published, but the matters recorded in this narrative are prior to that period, and some of them, as may be easily seen, can be but very little known. End of footnote. End of section 31. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 32 of Why Do We Need a Public Library? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Why Do We Need a Public Library? By Various. Section 32. Rights of Man, Part the First, being an answer to Mr. Burke's attack on the French Revolution, by Thomas Paine, Part 4. Miscellaneous Chapter. To prevent interrupting the argument in the preceding part of this work, or the narrative that follows it, I reserved some observations to be thrown together in a miscellaneous chapter, by which variety might not be censured for confusion. Mr. Burke's book is all miscellany. His intention was to make an attack on the French Revolution, but instead of proceeding with an orderly arrangement, he has stormed it with a mob of ideas tumbling over and destroying one another. But this confusion and contradiction in Mr. Burke's book is easily accounted for. When a man in a wrong cause attempts to steer his course by anything else than some polar truth or principle, he is sure to be lost. It is beyond the compass of his capacity to keep all the parts of an argument together, and make them unite in one issue, by any other means than having this guide always in view, Neither memory nor invention will supply the want of it. The former fails him, and the latter betrays him. Notwithstanding the nonsense, for it deserves no better name, that Mr. Burke has asserted about hereditary rights and hereditary succession, and that a nation has not a right to form a government of itself, it happened to fall in his way to give some account of what government is. Quote, "Government," says he, "is a contrivance of human wisdom." Unquote. Admitting that government is a contrivance of human wisdom, it must necessarily follow that hereditary succession and hereditary rights, as they are called, can make no part of it, because it is impossible to make wisdom hereditary, and on the other hand, that cannot be a wise contrivance, which in its operation may commit the government of a nation to the wisdom of an idiot. The ground which Mr. Burke now takes is fatal to every part of his cause. The argument changes from hereditary rights to hereditary wisdom, and the question is, who is the wisest man? He must now show that every one in the line of hereditary succession was a Solomon, or his title is not good to be a king. What a stroke has Mr. Burke now made! To use a sailor's phrase, he has swabbed the deck and scarcely left a name legible in the list of kings, and he has mowed down and thinned the House of Peers with a scythe as formidable as death and time. But Mr. Burke appears to have been aware of this retort, and he has taken care to guard against it by making government to be not only a contrivance of human wisdom, but a monopoly of wisdom. He puts the nation as fools on one side, and places his government of wisdom, all wise men of Gotham, on the other side. And he then proclaims and says that, quote, "Men have a right that their wants should be provided for by this wisdom." Unquote. Having thus made proclamation, he next proceeds to explain to them what their wants are, and also what their rights are. In this he has succeeded dexterously, for he makes their wants to be a want of wisdom, but as this is cold comfort, he then informs them that they have a right, not to any of the wisdom, but to be governed by it, and in order to impress them with a solemn reverence for this monopoly government of wisdom, and of its vast capacity for all purposes, possible or impossible, right or wrong, he proceeds with astrological mysterious importance to tell them its powers in these words, quote, "The rights of man in government are their advantages, and these are often in balance between differences of good, and in compromises sometimes between good and evil, and sometimes between evil and evil. Political reason is a computing principle, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, morally and not metaphysically or mathematically, true moral denominations." Unquote. As the wondering audience, whom Mr. Burke supposes himself talking to, may not understand all this learned jargon, I will undertake to be its interpreter. The meaning then, good people, of all this is, that government is governed by no principle whatever, that it can make evil good or good evil, just as it pleases. In short, that government is arbitrary power. But there are some things which Mr. Burke has forgotten. First, he has not shown where the wisdom originally came from, and secondly, he has not shown by what authority it first began to act. In the manner he introduces the matter, it is either government stealing wisdom, or wisdom stealing government. It is without an origin, and its powers without authority. In short, it is usurpation. Whether it be from a sense of shame, or from a consciousness of some radical defect in a government necessary to be kept out of sight, or from both, or from any other cause, I undertake not to determine, but so it is, that a monarchical reasoner never traces government to its source, or from its source. It is one of the shibboleths by which he may be known. 1,000 years hence, those who shall live in America or France will look back with contemplative pride on the origin of their government and say, "This was the work of our glorious ancestors." But what can a monarchical talker say? What has he to exult in? Alas, he has nothing. A certain something forbids him to look back to a beginning, lest some robber or some Robin Hood should rise from the long obscurity of time and say, "I am the origin." Hard as Mr. Burke labored at the Regency Bill and hereditary succession 2 years ago, and much as he dived for precedents, he still had not boldness enough to bring up William of Normandy and say, "There is the head of the list. There is the fountain of honor, the son of a prostitute, and the plunderer of the English nation." The opinions of men with respect to government are changing fast in all countries. The revolutions of America and France have thrown a beam of light over the world which reaches into man. The enormous expense of governments has provoked people to think by making them feel, and when once the veil begins to rend, it admits not of repair. Ignorance is of a peculiar nature. Once dispelled, it is impossible to reestablish it. It is not originally a thing of itself, but is only the absence of knowledge, and though man may be kept ignorant, he cannot be made ignorant. The mind, in discovering truth, acts in the same manner as it acts through the eye in discovering objects. When once any object has been seen, it is impossible to put the mind back to the same condition it was in before it saw it. Those who talk of a counter-revolution in France show how little they understand of man. There does not exist in the compass of language an arrangement of words to express so much as the means of effecting a counter-revolution. The means must be an obliteration of knowledge, and it has never yet been discovered how to make man unknow his knowledge or unthink his thoughts. Mr. Burke is laboring in vain to stop the progress of knowledge, and it comes with the worse grace from him, as there is a certain transaction known in the city which renders him suspected of being a pensioner in a fictitious name. This may account for some strange doctrine he has advanced in his book, which, though he points it at the Revolution Society, is effectually directed against the whole nation. Quote, "The King of England," says he, "holds his crown, for it does not belong to the nation, according to Mr. Burke, in contempt of the choice of the Revolution Society, who have not a single vote for a king among them, either individually or collectively, and his Majesty's heirs, each in their time and order, will come to the crown with the same contempt of their choice, with which his Majesty has succeeded to that which he now wears." Unquote. As to who is king in England or elsewhere, or whether there is any king at all, or whether the people choose a Cherokee chief or a Hessian hussar for a king, it is not a matter that I trouble myself about. Be that to themselves. But with respect to the doctrine, so far as it relates to the rights of men and nations, it is as abominable as anything ever uttered in the most enslaved country under heaven. Whether it sounds worse to my ear by not being accustomed to hear such despotism than what it does to another person, I am not so well a judge of, but of its abominable principle I am at no loss to judge. It is not the Revolution Society that Mr. Burke means. It is the nation, as well in its original as in its representative character, and he is taking care to make himself understood by saying that they have not a vote, either collectively or individually. The Revolution Society is composed of citizens of all denominations, and of members of both the Houses of Parliament, and consequently, if there is not a right to vote in any of the characters, there can be no right to any either in the nation or in its parliament. This ought to be a caution to every country how to import foreign families to be kings. It is somewhat curious to observe that although the people of England had been in the habit of talking about kings, it is always a foreign house of kings, hating foreigners yet governed by them. It is now the House of Brunswick, one of the petty tribes of Germany. It has hitherto been the practice of the English parliaments to regulate what was called the succession, taking it for granted that the nation then continued to accord to the form of annexing a monarchical branch of its government, for without this the Parliament could not have had authority to have sent either to Holland or to Hanover, or to impose a king upon the nation against its will. And this must be the utmost limit to which Parliament can go upon this case. But the right of the nation goes to the whole case, because it has the right of changing its whole form of government. The right of a parliament is only a right in trust, a right by delegation, and that but from a very small part of the nation, and one of its houses has not even this. But the right of the nation is an original right, as universal as taxation. The nation is the paymaster of everything, and everything must conform to its general will. I remember taking notice of a speech in what is called the English House of Peers, by the then Earl of Shelburne, and I think it was at the time he was minister, which is applicable to this case. I do not directly charge my memory with every particular, but the words and the purport, as nearly as I remember, were these, quote, that the form of a government was a matter wholly at the will of the nation at all times, that if it chose a monarchical form, it had a right to have it so, and if it afterwards chose to be a republic, it had a right to be a republic, and to say to a king, "We have no longer any occasion for you." Unquote. When Mr. Burke says that, quote, his Majesty's heirs and successors, each in their time and order, will come to the crown with the same content of their choice with which his majesty had succeeded to that he wears," unquote, it is saying too much even to the humblest individual in the country, part of whose daily labor goes towards making up the millions sterling a year which the country gives to the person it styles a king. Government with insolence is despotism, but when contempt is added, it becomes worse, and to pay for contempt is the excess of slavery. This species of government comes from Germany and reminds me of what one of the Brunswick soldiers told me who was taken prisoner by the Americans in the late war. Quote, "Ah," said he, "America is a fine free country. It is worth the people's fighting for. I know the difference by knowing my own. In my country, if the prince says eat straw, we eat straw," unquote. God help that country, thought I, be it England or elsewhere, whose liberties are to be protected by German principles of government and princes of Brunswick. As Mr. Burke sometimes speaks of England, sometimes of France, and sometimes of the world, and of government in general, it is difficult to answer his book without apparently meeting him on the same ground. Although principles of government are general subjects, it is next to impossible in many cases to separate them from the idea of place and circumstance, and the more so when circumstances are put for arguments, which is frequently the case with Mr. Burke. In the former part of his book, addressing himself to the people of France, he says, quote, "No experience has taught us," meaning the English, "that in any other course or method than that of a hereditary crown can our liberties be regularly perpetuated and preserved sacred as our hereditary right." Unquote. I ask Mr. Burke, who is to take them away? Monsieur de Lafayette, in speaking to France, says, quote, "For a nation to be free, it is sufficient that she wills it." Unquote. But Mr. Burke represents England as wanting capacity to take care of itself, and that its liberties must be taken care of by a king holding it in contempt. If England is sunk to this, it is preparing itself to eat straw, as in Hanover or in Brunswick. But besides the folly of the declaration, it happens that the facts are all against Mr. Burke. It was by the government being hereditary that the liberties of the people were endangered. Charles I and James II are instances of this truth. Yet neither of them went so far as to hold the nation in contempt. As it is sometimes of advantage to the people of one country to hear what those of other countries have to say respecting it, it is possible that the people of France may learn something from Mr. Burke's book, and that the people of England may also learn something from the answers it will occasion. When nations fall out about freedom, a wide field of debate is open. The argument commences with the rights of war, without its evils, and as knowledge is the object contended for, the party that sustains the defeat obtains the prize. Mr. Burke talks about what he calls a hereditary crown, as if it were some production of nature, or as if, like time, it had a power to operate, not only independently, but in spite of man, or as if it were a thing or a subject universally consented to. Alas, it has none of those properties, but is the reverse of them all. It is a thing in imagination, the propriety of which is more than doubted, and the legality of which in a few years will be denied. But to arrange this matter in a clearer view than what general expression can heads under which what is called a hereditary crown, or more properly speaking, a hereditary succession to the government of a nation, can be considered, which are, first, the right of a particular family to establish itself. Secondly, the right of a nation to establish a particular family. With respect to the first of these heads, that of a family establishing itself with hereditary powers on its own authority, and independent of the consent of a nation, all men will concur in calling it despotism, and it would be trespassing on their understanding to attempt to prove it. But the second head, that of a nation establishing a particular family with hereditary powers, does not present itself as despotism on the first reflection. But if men will permit it a second reflection to take place, and carry that reflection forward but one remove out of their own persons to that of their offspring, they will then see that hereditary succession becomes in its consequences the same despotism to others, which they reprobated for themselves. It operates to preclude the consent of the succeeding generations, and the preclusion of consent is despotism. When the person who at any time shall be in possession of a government, or those who stand in succession to him, shall say to a nation, I hold this power in contempt of you, it signifies not on what authority he pretends to say it. It is no relief, but an aggravation to a person in slavery to reflect that he was sold by his parent, and as that which heightens the criminality of an act cannot be produced to prove the legality of it, hereditary succession cannot be established as a legal thing. In order to arrive at a more perfect decision on this head, it will be proper to consider the generation which undertakes to establish a family with hereditary powers, apart and separate from the generations which are to follow, and also to consider the character in which the first generation acts with respect to succeeding generations. The generation which first selects a person and puts him at the head of its government, either with the title of king or any other distinction, acts on its own choice, be it wise or foolish, as a free agent for itself. The person so set up is not hereditary, but selected and appointed, and the generation who sets him up does not live under a hereditary government, but under a government of its own choice and establishment. Were the generation who sets him up, and the person so set up, to live forever, it never could become hereditary succession, and of consequence hereditary succession can only follow on the death of the first parties. As, therefore, hereditary succession is out of the question with respect to the first generation, we have now to consider the character in which that generation acts with respect to the commencing generation, and to all succeeding ones. It assumes a character to which it has neither right nor title. It changes itself from a legislator to a testator, and affects to make its will, which is to have operation after the demise of the makers, to bequeath the government, and it not only attempts to bequeath, but to establish on the succeeding generation a new and different form of government under which itself lived. Itself, as already observed, lived not under a hereditary government, but under a government of its own choice and establishment, and it now attempts, by virtue of a will and testament, and which it has not authority to make, to take from the commencing generation and all future ones the rights and free agency by which itself acted. But exclusive of the right which any generation has to act collectively as a testator, the objects to which it applies itself in this case are not within the compass of any law or of any will or testament. The rights of men in society are neither divisible nor transferable, nor annihilable, but are descendable only, and it is not in the power of any generation to intercept finally and cut off the descent. If the present generation, or any other, are disposed to be slaves, it does not lessen the right of the succeeding generation to be free. Wrongs cannot have a legal descent. When Mr. Burke attempts to maintain that the English nation did at the Revolution of 1688 most solemnly renounce and abdicate their rights for themselves and for all their posterity forever, he speaks a language that merits not reply, and which can only excite contempt for his prostitute principles or pity for his ignorance. In whatever light hereditary succession, as growing out of the will and testament of some former generation, presents itself, it is an absurdity. A cannot make a will to take from B the property of B and give it to C. Yet this is the manner in which what is called hereditary succession by law operates. A certain former generation made a will to take away the rights of the commencing generation and all future ones, and convey those rights to a third person, who afterwards comes forward and tells them, in Mr. Burke's language, that they have no rights, that their rights are already bequeathed to him, and that he will govern in contempt of them. From such principles and such ignorance, good Lord deliver the world. But, after all, what is this metaphor called a crown? Or rather, what is monarchy? Is it a thing, or is it a name, or is it a fraud? Is it a contrivance of human wisdom, or of human craft to obtain money from a nation under specious pretenses? Is it a thing necessary to a nation? If it is, in what does that necessity consist? What service does it perform? What is its business, and what are its merits? Does the virtue consist in the metaphor or in the man? Doth the goldsmith that makes the crown make the virtue also? Doth it operate like Fortunatus's wishing cap, or Harlequin's wooden sword? Doth it make a man a conjurer? In fine, what is it? It appeared to be something going much out of fashion, falling into ridicule, and rejected in some countries, both as unnecessary and expensive. In America it is considered as an absurdity, and in France it is so far declined that the goodness of the man and the respect for his personal character are the only things that preserve the appearance of its existence. If government be what Mr. Burke describes it, a contrivance of human wisdom, I might ask him, if wisdom was at such a low ebb in England that it was become necessary to import it from Holland and from Hanover, But I will do the country the justice to say that was not the case, and even if it was, it mistook the cargo. The wisdom of every country, when properly exerted, is sufficient for all its purposes, and there could exist no more real occasion in England to have sent for a Dutch stadtholder or a German elector than there was in America to have done a similar thing. If a country does not understand its own affairs, how is a foreigner to understand them, who knows neither its laws, its manners, nor its language? If there existed a man so transcendently wise above all others that his wisdom was necessary to instruct a nation, some reason might be offered for monarchy. But when we cast our eyes about a country, and observe how every part understands its own affairs, and when we look around the world and see that of all men in it the race of kings are the most insignificant in capacity, our reason cannot fail to ask us, what are those men kept for? If there is anything in monarchy which we people of America do not understand, I wish Mr. Burke would be so kind as to inform us. I see in America a government extending over a country 10 times as large as England, and conducted with regularity for a 40th part of the expense which government costs in England. If I ask a man in America if he wants a king, he retorts, and asks me if I take him for an idiot. How is it that this difference happens? Are we more or less wise than others? I see in America the generality of people living in a style of plenty unknown in monarchical countries, and I see that the principle of its government, which is that of the equal rights of man, is making a rapid progress in the world. If monarchy is a useless thing, why is it kept up anywhere? And if a necessary thing, how can it be dispensed with? That civil government is necessary, all civilized nations will agree, but civil government is republican government. All that part of the government of England which begins with the office of constable and proceeds through the department of magistrate, quarter sessions, and general assize, including trial by jury, is republican government. Nothing of monarchy appears in any part of it, except in the name which William the Conqueror imposed upon the English, that of obliging them to call him their sovereign lord the king. It is easy to conceive that a band of interested men, such as placemen, pensioners, lords of the bedchamber, lords of the kitchen, lords of the necessary house, and the Lord knows what besides, can find as many reasons for monarchy as their salaries, paid at the expense of the country, amount to. But if I ask the farmer, the manufacturer, the merchant, the tradesman, and down through all the occupations of life to the common laborer, what service is monarchy to him? He can give me no answer. If I ask him what monarchy is, he believes it is something like a sinecure. Notwithstanding the taxes of England amount to almost 17 millions a year, said to be for the expenses of government, it is still evident that the sense of the nation is left to govern itself, and does govern itself, by magistrates and juries almost at its own charge, on republican principles exclusive of the expense of taxes. The salaries of the judges are almost the only charge that is paid out of the revenue. Considering that all the internal government is executed by the people, the taxes of England ought to be the lightest of any nation in Europe, instead of which they are the contrary. As this cannot be accounted for on the score of civil government, the subject necessarily extends itself to the monarchical part. When the people of England sent for George I, and it would puzzle a wiser man than Mr. Burke to discover for what he could be wanted, or what service he could render, they ought at least to have conditioned for the abandonment of Hanover. Besides the endless German intrigues that must follow from a German elector being King of England, there is a natural impossibility of uniting in the same person the principles of freedom and the principles of despotism, or as it is usually called in England, arbitrary power. A German elector is in his electorate a despot. How then could it be expected that he should be attached to principles of liberty in one country, while his interest in another was to be supported by despotism? The union cannot exist, and it might easily have been foreseen that German electors would make German kings, or in Mr. Burke's words, would assume government with contempt. The English have been in the habit of considering a king of England only in the character in which he appears to them, whereas the same person, while the connection lasts, has a home seat in another country, the interest of which is different to their own, and the principles of the governments in opposition to each other. To such a person, England will appear as a town residence, and the electorate as the estate. The English may wish, as I believe they do, success to the principles of liberty in France, or in Germany, but a German elector trembles for the fate of despotism in his electorate. and the Duchy of Mecklenburg, where the present Queen's family governs, is under the same wretched state of arbitrary power and the people in slavish vassalage. There never was a time when it became the English to watch continental intrigues more circumspectly than at the present moment, and to distinguish the politics of the electorate from the politics of the nation. The Revolution of France has entirely changed the ground with respect to England and France as nations, but the German despots, with Prussia at their head, are combining against liberty, and the fondness of Mr. Pitt for office, and the interest which all his family connections have obtained, do not give sufficient security against this intrigue. As everything which passes in the world becomes matter for history, I will now quit this subject, and take a concise review of the state of parties and politics in England, as Mr. Burke has done in France. Whether the present reign commenced with contempt, I leave to Mr. Burke. Certain, however, it is that it had strongly that appearance. The animosity of the English nation, it is very well remembered, ran high, and had the true principles of liberty been as well understood then as they now promise to be, it is probable the nation would not have patiently submitted to so much. George I and II were sensible of a rival in the remains of the Stuarts, and as they could not but consider themselves as standing on their good behavior, they had prudence to keep their German principles of government to themselves. But as the Stuart family wore away, the prudence became less necessary. The contest between rights and what were called prerogatives continued to heat the nation till some time after the conclusion of the American War, when all at once it fell a calm. Execration exchanged itself for applause, and court popularity sprung up like a mushroom in a night. To account for this sudden transition, it is proper to observe that there are two distinct species of popularity, the one excited by merit, and the other by resentment. As the nation had formed itself into two parties, and each was extolling the merits of its parliamentary champions for and against prerogative, nothing could operate to give a more general shock than an immediate coalition of the champions themselves. The partisans of each, being thus suddenly left in the lurch, and mutually heated with disgust at the measure, felt no other relief than uniting in a common execration against both. A higher stimulus or resentment being thus excited than what the contest on prerogatives occasioned, the nation quitted all former objects of rights and wrongs, and sought only that of gratification. The indignation at the coalition so effectually superseded the indignation against the court as to extinguish it, and without any change of principles on the part of the court, the same people who had reprobated its despotism united with it to revenge themselves on the coalition parliament. The case was not which they liked best, but which they hated most, and the least hated passed for love. The dissolution of the coalition parliament, as it afforded the means of gratifying the resentment of the nation, could not fail to be popular, and from hence arose the popularity of the court. Transitions of this kind exhibit a nation under the government of temper, instead of a fixed and steady principle, and having once committed itself, however rashly, it feels itself urged along to justify by continuance its first proceeding. Measures which at other times it would censure it now approves, and acts persuasion upon itself to suffocate its judgment. On the return of a new parliament, the new minister, Mr. Pitt, found himself in a secure majority, and the nation gave him credit, not out of regard to himself, but because it had resolved to do it out of resentment to another. He introduced himself to public notice by a proposed reform of Parliament, which in its operation would have amounted to a public justification of corruption. The nation was to be at the expense of buying up the rotten boroughs, whereas it ought to punish the persons who deal in the traffic. Passing over the two bubbles of the Dutch business and the million a year to sink the national debt, the matter which most presents itself is the affair of the Regency. Never in the course of my observation was delusion more successfully acted, nor a nation more completely deceived. But to make this appear, it will be necessary to go over the circumstances. Mr. Fox had stated in the House of Commons that the Prince of Wales, as heir in succession, had a right in himself to assume the government. This was opposed by Mr. Pitt, and so far as the opposition was confined to the doctrine, it was just. But the principles which Mr. Pitt maintained on the contrary side were as bad or worse in their extent than those of Mr. Fox, because they went to establish an aristocracy over the nation, and over the small representation it has in the House of Commons. Whether the English form of government be good or bad, is not in this case the question. But taking it as it stands, without regard to its merits or demerits, Mr. Pitt was farther from the point than Mr. Fox. It is supposed to consist of 3 parts. While therefore the nation is disposed to continue this form, the parts have a national standing, independent of each other, and are not the creatures of each other. Had Mr. Fox passed through Parliament and said that the person alluded to claimed on the grounds of the nation, Mr. Pitt must then have contended what he called the right of the Parliament against the right of the nation. By the appearance which the contest made, Mr. Fox took the hereditary ground, and Mr. Pitt the parliamentary ground. But the fact is, they both took hereditary ground, and Mr. Pitt took the worst of the 2. What is called the Parliament is made up of 2 houses, one of which is more hereditary and more beyond the control of the nation than what the Crown, as it is called, is supposed to be. It is a hereditary aristocracy, assuming and asserting indefeasible, irrevocable rights and authority, wholly independent of the nation. Where, then, was the merited popularity of exalting this hereditary power over another hereditary power, less independent of the nation than what itself assumed to be, and of absorbing the rights of the nation into a house over which it has neither election nor control? The general impulse of the nation was right, but it acted without reflection. It approved the opposition made to the right set up by Mr. Fox, without perceiving that Mr. Pitt was supporting another indefeasible right more remote from the nation, in opposition to it. With respect to the House of Commons, it is elected but by a small part of the nation. But were the election as universal as taxation, which it ought to be, it would still be only the organ of the nation, and cannot possess inherent rights. When the National Assembly of France resolves a matter, the resolve is made in right of the nation. But Mr. Pitt, on all national questions, so far as they refer to the House of Commons, absorbs the rights of the nation into the organ, and makes the organ into a nation, and the nation itself into a cipher. In a few words, the question on the Regency was a question of $1 million a year, which is appropriated to the executive department, and Mr. Pitt could not possess himself of any management of this sum without setting up the supremacy of Parliament, and when this was accomplished, it was indifferent who should be regent, as he must be regent at his own cost. Among the curiosities which this contentious debate afforded was that of making the Great Seal into a king, the affixing of which to an act was to be royal authority. If, therefore, royal authority is a Great Seal, it consequently is in itself nothing, and a good constitution would be of infinitely more value to the nation than what the 3 nominal powers, as they now stand, are worth. The continual use of the word constitution in the English Parliament shows there is none, and that the whole is merely a form of government without a constitution, and constituting itself with what powers it pleases. If there were a constitution, it certainly could be referred to, and the debate on any constitutional point would terminate by producing the Constitution. One member says, "This is the Constitution," and another says, "That is the Constitution." Today it is one thing, and tomorrow something else, while the maintaining of the debate proves there is none. Constitution is now the cant word of Parliament, tuning itself to the ear of the nation. Formerly it was the universal supremacy of Parliament, the omnipotence of Parliament. But since the progress of liberty in France, those phrases have a despotic harshness in their note, and the English Parliament have catched the fashion from the National Assembly, but without the substance, of speaking of constitution. As the present generation of the people in England did not make the government, they are not accountable for any of its defects, but that sooner or later it must come into their hands to undergo a constitutional reformation, is as certain as that the same thing has happened in France. If France, with a revenue of nearly 24 millions sterling, with an extent of rich and fertile country above 4 times larger than England, with a population of 24 millions of inhabitants to support taxation, with upwards of 90 millions sterling of gold and silver circulating in the nation, and with a debt less than the present debt of England, still found it necessary from whatever cause to come to a settlement of its affairs, it solves the problem of funding for both countries. It is out of the question to say how long what is called the English Constitution has lasted, and to argue from thence how long it is to last. The question is, how long can the funding system last? It is a thing but of modern invention, and has not yet continued beyond the life of a man. Yet in that short space it has so far accumulated that, together with the current expenses, It requires an amount of taxes at least equal to the whole landed rental of the nation, in acres, to defray the annual expenditure. That a government could not have always gone on by the same system which has been followed for the last 70 years must be evident to every man, and for the same reason it cannot always go on. The funding system is not money, neither is it, properly speaking, credit. It, in effect, creates upon paper the sum which it appears to borrow, and lays on a tax to keep the imaginary capital alive by the payment of interest, and sends the annuity to market to be sold for paper already in circulation. If any credit is given, it is to the disposition of the people to pay the tax, and not to the government, which lays it on. When this disposition expires, what is supposed to be the credit of the government expires with it. The instance of France under the former government shows that it is impossible to compel the payment of taxes by force, when a whole nation is determined to take its stand upon that ground. Mr. Burke, in his review of the finances of France, states the quantity of gold and silver in France at about 88 millions sterling. In doing this, he has, I presume, divided by the difference of exchange instead of the standard of 24 livres to a pound sterling, for M. Necker's statement, from which Mr. Burke's is taken, is 2,200 millions of livres, which is upwards of 91 millions and a half sterling. M. Necker in France and Mr. George Chalmers at the Office of Trade and Plantation in England, of which Lord Hawkesbury is president, published nearly about the same time, 1786, an account of the quantity of money in each nation, from the returns of the mint of each nation. Mr. Chalmers, from the returns of the English mint at the Tower of London, states the quantity of money in England, including Scotland and Ireland, to be 20 millions sterling. Footnote. See Estimate of the Comparative Strength of Great Britain by G. Chalmers. End of footnote. M. Necker says that the amount of money in France, recoined from the old coin which was called in, was 2,500 millions of livres, upward of 104 millions sterling, and after deducting for waste, and what may be in the West Indies or other possible circumstances, states the circulation quantity at home to be 91 millions and a half sterling. Footnote. See Administration of the Finances of France, Volume 3, by M. Necker. End of footnote. But, taking it as Mr. Burke has put it, it is 68 millions more than the national quantity in England. That the quantity of money in France cannot be under this sum may at once be seen from the state of the French revenue, without referring to the records of the French mint for proofs. The revenue of France, prior to the Revolution, was nearly 24 millions sterling, and as paper had then no existence in France, the whole revenue was collected upon gold and silver, and it would have been impossible to have collected such a quantity of revenue upon a less national quantity than M. Necker has stated. Before the establishment of paper in England, the revenue was about a fourth part of the national amount of gold and silver, as may be known by referring to the revenue prior to King William, and the quantity of money stated to be in the nation at that time, which was nearly as much as it is now. It can be of no real service to a nation to impose upon itself or to permit itself to be imposed upon, but the prejudices of some and the imposition of others have always represented France as a nation possessing but little money, whereas the quantity is not only more than 4 times what the quantity is in England, but is considerably greater on a proportion of numbers. To account for this deficiency on the part of England, some reference should be had to the English system of funding. It operates to multiply paper, and to substitute it in the room of money in various shapes, and the more paper is multiplied, the more opportunities are offered to export the specie, and it admits of a possibility, by extending it to small notes, of increasing paper till there is no money left. I know this is not a pleasant subject to English readers, but the matters I am going to mention are so important in themselves as to require the attention of men interested in money transactions of a public nature. There is a circumstance stated by M. Necker in his treatise on the administration of the finances, which has never been attended to in England, but which forms the only basis whereon to estimate the quantity of money, gold and silver, which ought to be in every nation in Europe, to preserve a relative proportion with other nations. Lisbon and Cadiz are the 2 ports into which money, gold and silver, from South America are imported, and which afterwards divide and spread themselves over Europe by means of commerce, and increase the quantity of money in all parts of Europe. If therefore the amount of the annual importation into Europe can be known, and the relative proportion of the foreign commerce of the several nations by which it can be distributed can be ascertained, they give a rule sufficiently true to ascertain the quantity of money which ought to be found in any nation, at any given time. M. Necker shows from the registers of Lisbon and Cadiz that the importation of gold and silver into Europe is 5 million sterling annually. He has not taken it on a single year, but on an average of 15 succeeding years, from 1763 to 1777, both inclusive, in which time the amount was 1,800 million livres, which is 75 million sterling. Footnote: Administration of the Finances of France, Volume 3. End of footnote. From the commencement of the Hanover succession in 1714 to the time Mr. Chalmers published is 72 years, and the quantity imported into Europe in that time would be 360 million sterling. If the foreign commerce of Great Britain be stated at a sixth part of what the whole foreign commerce of Europe amounts to, which is probably an inferior estimation to what the gentlemen of the exchange would allow, the proportion which Britain should draw by commerce of this sum to keep herself on a proportion with the rest of Europe would also be a sixth part, which is 60 million sterling. And if the same allowance for waste and accident be made for England, which M. Necker makes for France, the quantity remaining after these deductions would be 52 million, and this sum ought to have been in the nation at the time Mr. Chalmers published, in addition to the sum which was in the nation at the commencement of the Hanover succession, and to have made in the whole at least 66 million sterling, instead of which there were but 20 million, which is 46 million below its proportionate quantity. As the quantity of gold and silver imported into Lisbon and Cadiz is more exactly ascertained than that of any commodity imported into England, and as the quantity of money coined at the Tower of London is still more positively known, the leading facts do not admit of controversy. Either, therefore, the commerce of England is unproductive of profit, or the gold and silver which it brings in leak continually away by unseen means at the average rate of about 750,000 a year, which in the course of 72 years accounts for the deficiency, and its absence is supplied by paper. Footnote: Whether the English commerce does not bring in money, or whether the government sends it out after it is brought in, is a matter which the parties concerned can best explain, but that the deficiency exists is not in the power of either to disprove. While Dr. Price, Mr. Eden, now Auckland, Mr. Chalmers and others were debating whether the quantity of money in England was greater or less than at the Revolution, the circumstance was not adverted to that since the Revolution there cannot have been less than 400 millions sterling imported into Europe, and therefore the quantity in England ought to at least have been 4 times greater than it was at the Revolution, to be on a proportion with Europe. What England is now doing by paper is what she would have been able to do by solid money if gold and silver had come into the nation in the proportion it ought, or had not been sent out, and she is endeavoring to restore by paper the balance she has lost by money. It is certain that the gold and silver which arrive annually in the register ships to Spain and Portugal do not remain in those countries. Taking the value half in gold and half in silver, it is about 400 tons annually. And from the number of ships and galloons employed by the trade of bringing those metals from South America to Portugal and Spain, the quantity sufficiently proves itself without referring to the registers. In the situation England now is, it is impossible she can increase in money. High taxes not only lessen the property of the individuals, but they lessen also the money capital of the nation by inducing smuggling, which can only be carried on by gold and silver. By the politics which the British government have carried on with the inland powers of Germany and the continent, it is made an enemy of all the maritime powers, and is therefore obliged to keep up a large navy. But though the navy is built in England, the naval stores must be purchased from abroad, and that from countries where the greatest part must be paid for in gold and silver. Some fallacious rumors have been set afloat in England to induce a belief in money, and among others that of the French refugees bringing large quantities. The idea is ridiculous. The general part of the money in France is silver, and it would take upwards of 20 of the largest broad-wheel wagons with 10 horses each to remove 1 million sterling of silver. Is it then to be supposed that a few people fleeing on horseback or in post-chaises, in a secret manner, and having the French custom house to pass and the sea to cross could bring even a sufficiency for their own expenses. When millions of money are spoken of, it should be recollected that such sums can only accumulate in a country by slow degrees and a long procession of time. The most frugal system that England could now adopt would not recover in a century the balance she has lost in money since the commencement of the Hanover succession. She is 70 millions behind France, and she must be in some considerable proportion behind every country in Europe, because the returns of the English mint do not show an increase of money, while the registers of Lisbon and Cadiz show an European increase of between 300 and 400 millions sterling. End of footnote. The Revolution of France is attended with many novel circumstances, not only in the political sphere, but in the circle of money transactions. Among others, it shows that a government may be in a state of insolvency and a nation rich. So far as the fact is confined to the late government of France, it was insolvent, because the nation would no longer support its extravagance, and therefore it could no longer support itself. But with respect to the nation, all the means existed. A government may be said to be insolvent every time it applies to the nation to discharge its arrears. The insolvency of the late government of France and the present of England differed in no other respect than as the dispositions of the people differ. The people of France refused their aid to the old government, and the people of England submit to taxation without inquiry. What is called the Crown in England has been insolvent several times, the last of which, publicly known, was in May 1777, when it applied to the nation to discharge upwards of £600,000 in private debts which otherwise it could not pay. It was the error of Mr. Pitt, Mr. Burke, and all those who were unacquainted with the affairs of France to confound the French nation with the French government. The French nation, in effect, endeavored to render the late government insolvent for the purpose of taking government into its own hands, and it reserved its means for the support of the new government. In a country of such vast extent and population as France, the natural means cannot be wanting, and the political means appear the instant the nation is disposed to permit them. When Mr. Burke, in a speech last winter in the British Parliament, cast his eyes over the map of Europe and saw a chasm that once was France, he talked like a dreamer of dreams. The same natural France existed as before, and all the natural means existed with it. The only chasm was that the extinction of despotism had left, and which was to be filled up with the Constitution, more formidable in resources than the power which had expired. Although the French nation rendered the late government insolvent, it did not permit the insolvency to act toward the creditors, and the creditors, considering the nation as the real paymaster, and the government only as the agent, rested themselves on the nation in preference to the government. This appears greatly to disturb Mr. Burke, as the precedent is fatal to the policy by which governments have supposed themselves secure. They have contracted debts with a view of attaching what is called the moneyed interest of a nation to their support. But the example in France shows that the permanent security of the creditor is in the nation and not in the government, and that in all possible revolutions that may happen in governments, the means are always with the nation, and the nation always in existence. Mr. Burke argues that the creditors ought to have abided the fate of the government which they trusted, but the National Assembly considered them as the creditors of the nation, and not of the government, of the master, and not of the steward. Notwithstanding the late government could not discharge the current expenses, the present government has paid off a great part of the capital. This has been accomplished by two means, the one by lessening the expenses of government, and the other by the sale of the monastic and ecclesiastical landed estates. The devotees and penitent debauchees, extortioners and misers of former days, to ensure themselves a better world than that they were about to leave, had bequeathed immense property in trust to the priesthood for pious uses, and the priesthood kept it for themselves. The National Assembly has ordered it to be sold for the good of the whole nation, and the priesthood to be decently provided for. In consequence of the Revolution, the annual interest of the debt of France will be reduced at least 6 millions sterling, by paying off upwards of 100 million of the capital, which, with lessening the former expenses of government at least 3 millions, will place France in a situation worthy the imitation of Europe. Upon a whole review of the subject, how vast is the contrast! While Mr. Burke has been talking of a general bankruptcy in France, the National Assembly has been paying off the capital of its debt, and while taxes have increased near 1 million a year in England, They have lowered several millions a year in France. Not a word has either Mr. Burke or Mr. Pitt said about the French affairs, or the state of the French finances, in the present session of Parliament. The subject begins to be too well understood, and imposition serves no longer. There is a general enigma running through the whole of Mr. Burke's book. He writes in a rage against the National Assembly, but what is he enraged about? If his assertions were as true as they are groundless, and that France by her revolution had annihilated her power and become what he calls a chasm, it might excite the grief of a Frenchman considering himself as a national man, and provoke his rage against the National Assembly. But why should it excite the rage of Mr. Burke? Alas, it is not the nation of France that Mr. Burke means, but the court, and every court in Europe, dreading the same fate, is in mourning. He writes neither in the character of a Frenchman nor an Englishman, but in the fawning character of that creature known in all countries, and a friend to none, a courtier. Whether it be the court of Versailles, or the court of St. James, or Carlton House, or the court in expectation, signifies not. For the caterpillar principle of all courts and courtiers are alike. They form a common policy throughout Europe, detached and separate from the interest of nations. And while they appear to quarrel, they agree to plunder. Nothing can be more terrible to a court or courtier than the Revolution of France. That which is a blessing to nations is bitterness to them, and as their existence depends on the duplicity of a country, they tremble at the approach of principles, and dread the precedent that threatens their overthrow. Conclusion. Reason and ignorance, the opposites of each other, influence the great bulk of mankind. If either of these can be rendered sufficiently extensive in a country, the machinery of government goes easily on, reason obeys itself, and ignorance submits to whatever is dictated to it. The two modes of the government which prevail in the world are, first, government by election and representation; secondly, government by hereditary succession. The former is generally known by the name of republic, the latter by that of monarchy and aristocracy. Those two distinct and opposite forms erect themselves on the two distinct and opposite bases of reason and ignorance. As the exercise of government requires talents and abilities, and as talents and abilities cannot have hereditary descent, it is evident that hereditary succession requires a belief from man to which his reason cannot subscribe, and which can only be established upon his ignorance. And the more ignorant any country is, the better it is fitted for this species of government. On the contrary, government in a well-constituted republic requires no belief from man beyond what his reason can give. He sees the rationale of the whole system, its origin and its operation, and as it is best supported when best understood, the human faculties act with boldness, and acquire, under this form of government, a gigantic manliness. As therefore each of those forms acts on a different base, the one moving freely by the aid of reason, the other by ignorance, we have next to consider what it is that gives motion to that species of government which is called mixed government, or, as it is sometimes ludicrously styled, a government of this, that, and t'other. The moving power in this species of government is, of necessity, corruption. However imperfect election and representation may be in mixed governments, they still give exercise to a greater portion of reason than is convenient to the hereditary part, and therefore it becomes necessary to buy the reason up. A mixed government is an imperfect everything, cementing and soldering the discordant parts together by corruption, to act as a whole. Mr. Burke appears highly disgusted that France, since she had resolved on a revolution, did not adopt what he calls a British constitution, and the regretful manner in which he expresses himself on this occasion implies a suspicion that the British constitution needs something to keep its defects in countenance. In mixed governments there is no responsibility. The parts cover each other till responsibility is lost, and the corruption which moves the machine contrives at the same time its own escape. When it is laid down as a maxim that a king can do no wrong, it places him in a state of similar security with that of idiots and persons insane, and responsibility is out of the question with respect to himself. It then descends upon the minister, who shelters himself under a majority in Parliament, which by places, pensions, and corruption he can always command, and that majority justifies itself by the same authority with which it protects the minister. In this rotatory motion, responsibility is thrown off from the parts and from the whole. When there is a part in a government which can do no wrong, it implies that it does nothing, and is only the machine of another power, by whose advice and direction it acts. What is supposed to be the king in the mixed governments is the cabinet, and as the cabinet is always a part of the parliament, and the members justifying in one character what they advise and act in another, a mixed government becomes a continual enigma, entailing upon a country by the quantity of corruption necessary to solder the parts, the expense of supporting all the forms of government at once, and finally resolving itself into a government by committee, in which the advisers, the actors, the approvers, the justifiers, the persons responsible, and the persons not responsible are the same persons. By this pantomimical contrivance and change of scene and character, the parts help each other out in matters which neither of them singly would assume to act. When money is to be obtained, the mass of variety apparently dissolves, and a profusion of parliamentary praises passes between the parts. Each admires with astonishment the wisdom, the liberality, the disinterestedness of the other, and all of them breathe a pitying sigh at the burdens of the nation. But in a well-constituted republic, nothing of this soldering, praising, and pitying can take place. The representation being equal throughout the country and complete in itself, however it may be arranged into legislative and executive, they have all one and the same natural source. The parts are not foreigners to each other like democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. As there are no discordant distinctions, there is nothing to corrupt by compromise, nor confound by contrivance. Public measures appeal of themselves to the understanding of the nation, and, resting on their own merits, disown any flattering applications to vanity. The continual whine of lamenting the burden of taxes, however successfully it may be practiced in mixed governments, is inconsistent with the sense and spirit of a republic. If taxes are necessary, they are of course advantageous, but if they require an apology, the apology itself implies an impeachment. Why, then, is man thus imposed upon, or why does he impose upon himself? When men are spoken of as kings and subjects, or when government is mentioned under the distinct and combined heads of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, what is it that reasoning man is to understand by the terms? If there really existed in the world two or more distinct and separate elements of human power, we should then see the several origins to which those terms would descriptively apply. But as there is but one species of man, there can be but one element of human power, and that element is man himself. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy are but creatures of imagination, and 1,000 such may be contrived as well as 3. From the revolutions of America and France, and the symptoms that have appeared in other countries, it is evident that the opinion of the world is changing with respect to systems of government, and that revolutions are not within the compass of political calculations. The progress of time and circumstances, which men assign to the accomplishment of great changes, is too mechanical to measure the force of the mind, and the rapidity of reflection by which revolutions are generated. All the old governments have received a shock from those that already appear, and which were once more improbable, and are a greater subject of wonder than a general revolution in Europe would be now. When we survey the wretched condition of man under the monarchical and hereditary systems of government, dragged from his home by one power or driven by another, and impoverished by taxes more than by enemies, it becomes evident that those systems are bad, and that a general revolution in the principle and construction of governments is necessary. What is government more than the management of the affairs of a nation? It is not, and from its nature cannot be, the property of any particular man or family, but of the whole community, at whose expense it is supported. And though by force and contrivance it has been usurped into an inheritance, the usurpation cannot alter the right of things. Sovereignty as a matter of right appertains to the nation only, and not to any individual. And a nation has at all times an inherent, indefeasible right to abolish any form of government it finds inconvenient, and to establish such as accords with its interest, disposition, and happiness. The romantic and barbarous distinction of men into kings and subjects, though it may suit the condition of courtiers, cannot that of citizens, and is exploded by the principle upon which governments are now founded. Every citizen is a member of the sovereignty, and as such can acknowledge no personal subjection, and his obedience can be only to the laws. When men think of what government is, they must necessarily suppose it to possess a knowledge of all the objects and matters upon which its authority is to be exercised. In this view of government, the republican system as established by America and France operates to embrace the whole of a nation, and the knowledge necessary to the interest of all the parts is to be found in the center, which the parts by representation form. But the old governments are on a construction that excludes knowledge as well as happiness. Government by monks, who knew nothing of the world beyond the walls of a convent, is as consistent as government by kings. What were formerly called revolutions were little more than a change of persons or an alteration of local circumstances. They rose and fell like things of course, and had nothing in their existence or their fate that could influence beyond the spot that produced them. But what we now see in the world from the revolutions of America and France are a renovation of the natural order of things, a system of principles as universal as truth and the existence of man, and combining moral with political happiness and national prosperity. Quote, 1. Men are born and always continue free and equal in respect of their rights. Civil distinctions therefore can be founded only on public utility. 2. The end of all political associations is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, and these rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance of oppression. 3. The nation is essentially the source of all sovereignty, nor can any individual or any body of men be entitled to any authority which is not expressly derived from it." Unquote. In these principles, there is nothing to throw a nation into confusion by inflaming ambition. They are calculated to call forth wisdom and abilities, and to exercise them for the public good, and not for the emolument or aggrandizement of particular descriptions of men or families. Monarchical sovereignty, the enemy of mankind and the source of misery, is abolished, and the sovereignty itself is restored to its natural and original place, the nation. Were this the case throughout Europe, the cause of wars would be taken away. It is attributed to Henry IV of France, a man of enlarged and benevolent heart, that he proposed about the year 1610 a plan for abolishing war in Europe. The plan consisted in constituting a European Congress, or, as the French authors style it, a Pacific Republic, by appointing delegates from the several nations who were to act as a court of arbitration in any disputes that might arise between nation and nation. Had such a plan been adopted at the time it was proposed, the taxes of England and France, as two of the parties, would have been at least 10 millions sterling annually to each nation less than they were at the commencement of the French Revolution. To conceive a cause why such a plan has not been adopted, and that instead of a Congress for the purpose of preventing war, it has been called only to terminate a war after a fruitless expense of several years, it will be necessary to consider the interest of governments as a distinct interest to that of nations. Whatever is the cause of taxes to a nation becomes also the means of revenue to government. Every war terminates with an addition of taxes, and consequently with an addition of revenue, and in any event of war, in the manner they are now commenced and concluded, the power and interest of governments are increased. War, therefore, from its productiveness, as it easily furnishes the pretense of necessity for taxes and appointments to places and offices, becomes a principal part of the system of old governments, and to establish any mode to abolish war, however advantageous it might be to nations, would be to take from such government the most lucrative of its branches. The frivolous matters upon which war is made show the disposition and avidity of governments to uphold the system of war, and betray the motives upon which they act. Why are not republics plunged into war, but because the nature of their government does not admit of an interest distinct from that of the nation? Even Holland, though an ill-constructed republic, and with a commerce extending over the world, existed nearly a century without war, and the instant the form of government was changed in France, the republican principles of peace and domestic prosperity and economy arose with the new government, and the same consequences would follow the cause in other nations. As war is the system of government on the old construction, the animosity which nations reciprocally entertain is nothing more than what the policy of their governments excites to keep up the spirit of the system. Each government accuses the other of perfidy, intrigue, and ambition as a means of heating the imagination of their respective nations and incensing them to hostilities. Man is not the enemy of man, but through the medium of a false system of government. Instead, therefore, of exclaiming against the ambition of kings, the exclamation should be directed against the principle of such governments. And instead of seeking to reform the individual, the wisdom of a nation should apply itself to reform the system. Whether the forms and maxims of governments which are still in practice were adapted to the condition of the world at the period they were established is not in this case the question. The older they are, the less correspondence can they have with the present state of things. Time and change of circumstances and opinions have the same progressive effect in rendering modes of government obsolete as they have upon customs and manners. Agriculture, commerce, manufactures, and the tranquil arts, by which the prosperity of nations is best promoted, require a different system of government and a different species of knowledge to direct its operations than what might have been required in the former condition of the world. As it is not difficult to perceive from the enlightened state of mankind that hereditary governments are verging to their decline, and that revolutions on the broad basis of national sovereignty and government by representation are making their way in Europe, it would be an act of wisdom to anticipate their approach and produce revolutions by reason and accommodation, rather than commit them to the issue of convulsions. From what we now see, nothing of reform in the political world ought to be held improbable. It is an age of revolutions, in which everything may be looked for. The intrigue of courts, by which the system of war is kept up, may provoke a confederation of nations to abolish it, and a European Congress to patronize the progress of free government, and promote the civilization of nations with each other, is an event nearer in probability than once were the revolutions and alliance of France and America. End of section 32. Recording by Colleen McMahon. End of Why Do We Need a Public Library by Various.